First of all, it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Aghion, Professor of Economics at the Collège de France and the London School of Economics. Thank you, Philippe, for participating in this 39th edition of the Barcelona Graduate School Lecture Series. I would also like to welcome Professor Antonio Penta and all of you, students and members of the academia in Barcelona, ladies and gentlemen, to this afternoon here at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. In a moment, I will hand you over to Antonio, who will highlight Dr. Aghion's distinguished career. But before this, let me say a few words about economic growth in the current environment. Following the financial crisis, central banks engaged in policies that drove down interest rates to historical minima. While there are undoubted benefits of these policies, maintaining them for a prolonged period brings about adverse consequences. On the one hand, there may be excessive risk-taking, which could lead to problems in the future. On the other hand, stressed by Professor Aghion's work, low interest rates can actually promote market concentration and in this way lower investment, thus breaking creative distraction engines. We cannot ignore that all these negative consequences of low interest rates concur with technological revolution, the fallout of globalization, and new trends in social media and communication. All those disruptive forces are potentially contributing at the same time to both market concentration and creative distraction. What seems clear is that firms' dynamics, market concentration, and creative distraction are becoming increasingly relevant in understanding macroeconomic growth. Today, it's a privileged opportunity for us to gain further insight into Professor Aghion's views on the dynamics of economic growth. So thank you very much again, Philippe, for being here, and Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So it's a great honor for me to introduce today's speaker, Professor Aghion. So as it was said, Philippe Aghion is professor at the Collège de France and the London School of Economics. Prior to that, he spent many years at Harvard University as Robert C. Wagner Professor of Economics. I think it's fair to say he's one of the most prolific and influential economists of his generation. Just taking numbers from Google Scholar, we're talking about more than 6,000 citations, age index of 110. I mean, we understand how remarkable these figures are. But more than that, his research focuses on economic growth, and although he's most renowned for his theoretical contributions, Professor Aghion has also undertaken highly influential empirical research in which the implications of his theories are tested on real-world data. With Peter Howitt, he pioneered the so-called Schumpeterian growth paradigm. Much of his work is summarized in their joint books on MIT Press, Endogenous Growth Theory and the Economic of Growth, and in his book with Rachel Griffith, The Competition of Growth. By focusing on innovation as a main source of economic growth, this approach opens the door to a deeper understanding of our organizations, competitive policy, education, savings, the financial system, and macroeconomic policy both affect and are affected by growth. In the process of exploring the link between growth and organizations, Professor Aghion has also made important contributions to the field of contract theory and corporate governance, especially on the question of how to allocate authority and control rights within a firm or between entrepreneurs and investors. The importance of his work has been acknowledged by several awards and recognitions. Just to name a few, he's Fellow of the Econometric Society since 1993, of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences since 1992. In 2001, he received the Irigo Jansson Award for the Best European Economist under age 45, and in 2009, the John von Neumann Award, which is one of the most prestigious awards in our discipline, whose recipients include several Nobel Prize winners, and one could say also many very likely future ones. The impact and breadth of his research is also testified by the Global Entrepreneurship Award, which he received in 2016, which is an award given to scholars who have produced scientific work of outstanding quality and importance concerning entrepreneurship and small business development, the role and importance of new firm formation, and the role of small and medium-sized enterprises in economic development. So there is no doubt, I think, that we are extremely lucky to have him today here as our 39th Barcelona GSE lecture speaker, and I guess with no further ado, I should leave the stage to him. Thank you.
Very generous and intimidating. Voilà. You raised expectations. So it's first, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I have several friends in this room. I would like to thank particularly Andreu, who was my main advisor at Harvard University. And I have my colleagues, Jaume, Jordi, and Luca was my student. You started becoming my student, undergraduate at PSA, and I have several familiar faces that I can see, and and it's moving to be here. Anyway, so as you said, with Peter, in fact, we met with Peter Howitt at MIT exactly 31 years ago, and I had heard about Schumpeter in lectures. I took a course by Dick Caves. You remember Dick Caves at Harvard? He would talk, and I had read a bit about Schumpeter, and I always asked, where is the model? But there was no model of Schumpeter. Where is the empirics? There was not truly, there were some things, but they were not true empiric. And but I had done some I/O and some general equilibrium theory and some I/O and in Harvard, and I wanted to model. I said, why don't we draw a model of Schumpeter? And when I was at MIT, my neighbor was Peter Howitt, and he was visiting just for 1 year from Western Ontario. And the way it works is that we used to, not everybody likes to do that, but we would walk out of our offices to just walk around. And somehow we met, he said, and he was a macroeconomist. He had worked a lot on search models, on monetary economics and search models, and so he had the techniques of search. And I had done more, micro, I/O, and I said, why don't we combine and we try to model build a model, that builds on some ideas of Schumpeter. So what we did, it was in September 1987, and we built a model of growth around three main ideas. The first idea is that long-run growth results from innovation. The second idea is that innovation do not come from heaven. They result from, profit-motivated, from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospect of monopoly rents. You can talk about policy of growth, because policy can influence growth because they influence, the incentive to engage in, innovation-enhancing activities. You can talk about policy of growth or institutions of growth. And the third idea, which is very important, is creative destruction, is that the new replaces the old. And therefore, growth becomes an interesting area. You can talk about the political economy of growth. You see what I mean? Because suddenly, and you have at the heart of the growth process a contradiction. It's that, in a sense, you need to give rents. You need society to give rents to people who innovate, to reward innovation. But you have to be careful that they don't use these rents to prevent subsequent innovators from entering. And that's at the heart of the growth process. Some institutions manage that better than others. And that's what makes growth an interesting area. You can talk about political economy of growth. And we wanted a growth model that would lend itself to micro-analysis. And that we did later on when we developed competition and growth, and we worked with Richard Blondel, and that has been very important, the work with Richard Blondel, because we wanted a growth model that we could work with microdata. Before, people used to do cross-country regression. We thought that was not what we should do. We should really go into, micro-analysis, look at competition and dynamics of firms, and that's what it became. And now you have a young generation with Clino, with Exigit, with many people. I call them my creative destruction, who do things much better than I would do. And they do exactly that. They go and they look at microdata and the firm dynamics, and they look in detail how that's related to growth process. And that was the adventure that we launched in 1987. Voilà, that's about the story with Howitt, okay? So I don't want to tell you about a love story and things and okay. So what's nice with the Schumpeterian paradigm is that, so we had a survey that we wrote with Howitt and Axigit called "What Do We Learn from Schumpeterian Growth Theory?" There is one version of it in a handbook of economic growth. There is one version of it in annual reviews. What do we learn from Schumpeterian growth theory? And there we list a series of predictions that only Schumpeterian growth can predict, which no other model could generate, or not an obvious way to us at least. And that's what we did there, okay? So what's nice with this paradigm is that you can think of enigma. For example, what is the relationship between competition and growth? Early endogenous growth model would predict that competition is bad for growth because you would reduce rents from innovation and therefore discourage growth. But we know that the evidence, if anything, points towards a positive relationship. How could you reconcile the empirics and the theory? Okay, so that started our adventure with Blondel. Okay, another thing, how you link growth with firm dynamics. You have a number of facts about firm dynamics. We know that the size distribution of firms is skewed. We know that exit rate of small firms is much bigger than exit rate of large firms. We know that there is a relationship between age and size. We know the number of facts. Do they matter for growth, and how do they link with the growth process? So there's been a big literature now developing. Also, there's been a big milestone of Klete-Kortum model there, playing an important role, okay? Other enigma is the middle income trap. That's something I very much work with Daron Acemoglu and Fabrizio Zilibotti. So I don't know, some of you went in Geneva when Zilibotti gave his presidential address on China. It was all about the middle income trap. Is how you have some countries, they start catching up, and at some moment they stop catching up because somehow they had maybe institutions that were, or policies that were good for catching up, but not so good for innovating at the frontier. So it was true for some middle-income trap countries. China is obsessed by that, by the way. They want to make sure they become an innovation-based economy. And the question is, can they become an innovation-based economy? Daron would tell them, disband the Communist Party. Some others said, maybe you can keep the Communist Party and still become an innovation-based economy. That would be a huge challenge. But even beyond middle income, France used to grow fast during the 30 years after World War II. And we stopped growing. Why? You see what I mean? Japan was growing very fast until the late 80s, and then Japan stopped growing. What's going on? They face the transition trap as well, you see? And so that's another area. And the one I want to talk today about is what we call the debate on secular stagnation, the Gordon debate. So the thing is that, one thing I'm sure it's just to get you in, but I'm sure you've all read about Gordon and his kind of pessimistic view. Although, I caricature Gordon a lot because, Gordon's views are much more nuanced than I would say, but it's just a way to, to make it more fun. Gordon has this idea that, in fact, the great innovation age is past, that, the big things were already invented, and now we are into the small things, okay? A bit so here, that's something done by France at Waves, drawn by people at Bank of France, but have been similar thing by others. In fact, if I were to push there, that wave would go much higher. So that would be the steam engine wave. And here you have the electricity chemistry. Here you have the information telecommunication. Alors, one way to look at the secular stagnation debate is to say, is a bit the Gordon way, and say the big thing was the first thing. That was okay. And this is less, and this is less. And somehow the view is being like, innovation is like a fruit-bearing tree. The best fruits you get first, and then you have to climb the tree at your risk of falling, of course. And you get fruits that are much bitter, not less good, etc. And the view there is that maybe that's the same with innovation. The big things you get first, and then you run out of steam. But so that's one way to look at the secular stagnation debate. The other way is to focus on the period since the last crisis, is to say there, what's strange is that, everybody talks about intelligence, artificial intelligence, that it would get us, complete abundance because the machines would do everything for us. Not only they would produce goods and services, but they would also produce ideas. And you should have kind of even what they call singularity and everything. But look at the growth rate. This is TFP. TFP growth is the dotted line. Labor productivity growth is the continuous line. And you see, since since the early 2000s, in the US, it's going down. And the question is that forever? Is that going forever? Will it reverse? And why is it going down? And what are the questions raised by that? And I will focus on growth over the past 30 years, but of course, at the end of the talk, I will talk about this going down. So people are preoccupied with the thing, should we be worried about this decline in productivity growth in the US? What does it reflect? And is it something which is irreversible? Is it something which is temporary? What's behind that? And that's what I would like to talk. And I argue that with also the Schumpeterian glasses, you can also say something on this debate. You see, you could have another, but this is another debate on which the Schumpeterian paradigm or perspective can lead you. That's what I want to convince you, that we can say something, okay? So what's very interesting is that at the same time, you see, if you look at patent flow in the US, it has gone up, you see what I mean, if anything. So of course you could say a lot of patents are not about true invention, they are about appropriation, but you could also restrict to triadic patents, to important patents. You know, you have all kind of metrics on patents that, that control for importance of patents. You see what I mean? And even if you restrict to those, your patenting has gone up. So it's very interesting to ask, how come the TFP growth is going down where patenting is going up? It looks like there is something there that you don't quite understand. So what I will try to do is to go into two parts. The first part, I will try to argue that there is a measurement problem, that there is somehow we don't know how to measure TFP growth properly, okay? And at the very last part, if I still have time, I will talk about work which is very much starting with the same co-authors with whom I did the missing growth stuff, where we try to come up with an explanation for the decline in productivity growth over the past years. I know that various people are around that question. It's becoming very topical, and we will say how we are thinking about it. The last thing is kind of very risky exercise because I talk about a research where there is no paper. It has been never talked about. See, so that's the first one. There are papers about it. Just something which is about the measurement. It's just smoking gun. But now you say, if I hate this diagram, it's just to motivate you. It's no proof of anything. But here I use panel data, and I rank two-digit sectors in the US. And what I do, you see, I have panel data on how much you see, on how much creative destruction there is, and I measure creative destruction by turnover rate, by firm turnover or by job turnover, the kind of Davis-Altiwanger way of measuring turnover. And on the other hand, I know about the amount of patenting in the sector and the amount of TFP growth. And one way here is that we look at years, so we do that, cross-sector panel, and we can look on average per year. And what this shows is that in the years where the rank correlation between TFP growth and patenting is higher, those years have less creative destruction. You see, so this hints at the fact that when you have more creative destruction, you seem to have less correlation between patenting and measured TFP growth. But I could have done that in another way. Instead of looking at years, I could have taken the whole period, but across sectors, and look at various sectors and rank them by the extent of creative destruction in the sector. And what I could show in those sectors where you have more creative destruction, the correlation between measured growth and patenting in the sector is less. Do you see what I mean? So you can do that in various ways, but whatever way you do, and this is proof of nothing, you get the same smoking gun that somehow creative destruction seems to be a source of measurement problem. Wherever or whenever there is more creative destruction, the correlation between patenting and measured TFP growth for some reason is lower. And you want to understand what's going on there, okay? And that's what I will get into, you see? So that's directly Schumpeterian. You cannot talk about this if you don't have creative destruction, obviously, okay? So why should the contribution of creative destruction, of innovation to TFP growth be more mismeasured in sectors or in years with higher creative destruction? Sorry. So the answer that we give, So that it's work with Pete Clino, Timo Boppard. Pete Clino is at Stanford. Timo Boppard is at the Institute of International Economics in Stockholm. Huey Lee, who is at the San Francisco Fed, and Antonin Bergeau is at the Bank of France. So our answer is that when creative destruction occurs and an item produced by a given seller has disappeared, the standard procedure used by statistical office to compute inflation is imputation. And that creates problems. So let me give you an example, okay? I always start with an example like this. So suppose, and then I will do the numerical. If you follow that, you already get most of the lecture. So look at this bottle, okay? And suppose that the statistical office can measure the monetary value. They do, usually. They know how to measure monetary value. Suppose between yesterday and today, the monetary value has gone up. You know it's, and I didn't make any change to the bottle. You know it's inflation. It's pure inflation. That's experience number one. Suppose now that I make a marginal change to the bottle. I change the tap. I put this tap is already very nice. I put an even nicer tap. And I look at the monetary value between yesterday and today, and it goes up. More or less, I could say that much is inflation, and that much is the improvement in the tap, okay? But what happens if I replace this bottle with this? I don't know what is inflation and what is real improvement. You see what I mean? Then the statistical office is lost. And what they do is for any category of products, they take the subset of products who have not been replaced between yesterday and today to infer the inflation rate on those, and then they extrapolate, and they say, I make the assumption that this rate of inflation will apply to the whole category of goods, including those who have been replaced. You see what I mean? And to make it clearer, I will consider an example. So let's look at this example. Suppose you have 80% of items are like the bottle which I did not replace, okay? There is no innovation, and there is a 4% inflation, okay? Suppose that 10% of items are like the bottle where I just replaced the tap, okay? So it's kind of innovation without creative destruction, and the quality-adjusted price goes down by 6%, I assume, okay? That's a minus 6% of the quality-adjusted price. And suppose there are 10% of items that are the bottle replaced by this object. And again, as a result, the quality-adjusted price goes down by 6%, okay? Suppose now that the statistical office knows the monetary growth. It knows that, he knows monetary values. Suppose that true inflation is 2 and true growth is 2. So monetary growth is 4. And I assume that the number 4, that is something that the monetary authority observes, okay? But in fact, it doesn't know how much is inflation and how much is growth. True inflation is 2, growth is 2, but they will not calculate that. How will they calculate inflation? They will say, look, my imputation says that I will ignore those guys. I will just impute that from there. So they will say, well, I ignore those goods. 80 over 80 plus 10, 8 over 9, have 4% inflation. And 10 over 80 plus 10, which is 1 over 9, have minus 6. And they will calculate an inflation rate of 2.9. But now they know that the monetary value went up by 4. They calculated an inflation of 2.9. Therefore, they deduce a real growth of 4 minus 2.9, which is 1.1. But the true growth is 2, so the missing growth is 0.9. You understand? If you understood that, you understood the whole lecture. You can leave, you can go. No, I don't want to stay with me. Don't leave me, okay? That's the idea, okay? Those are just numbers, and we will see that, in fact, what we find is very close to these numbers. So, but that's the reasoning, okay? So we build on 2 parts. The main part is the US paper, which is now revised, resubmit for the American Economic Review. And the second one, I gave my presidential address in Lisbon last year, and it just came out in the JEA. So let me just tell you about the model very quickly. Huh? I don't want to bother you with a lot of modeling. I just do the minimal, okay? So you start with a kind of toy Schumpeterian model. Toy, very much toy. Toy first because I take discrete time, not continuous time. In each period, the economy is populated by mass L of identical one period V individuals. Usually you have infinitely V individual. Okay, here I simplify. One period live individual. Final good production, that is really Mickey Mouse, okay? Because it's late evening, Friday, I have compassion, okay? Okay, so final good is produced with a continuum of intermediate input, and Q omega is the quality of the intermediate input omega. And sigma is very important. Sigma measures the elasticity of substitution between intermediate inputs. This plays a very important role, as we will see later. Okay? So now innovation in this model will come for three things. Growth will come from the fact that Q omega goes up. And so that's quality innovation. But we also allow, because I'm open-minded, you know I'm not a fan of variety models, but still I'm open-minded, and I allow N to grow, okay? So now, as usual in these models, that's the final good production. You assume that the final good is competitive, so each intermediate input is paid its marginal productivity in producing the final good. Then I assume that each intermediate input omega is produced one for one with labor, okay? So if the final good is competitive, each intermediate good is paid its marginal productivity. So then profit maximization will give you a P omega, which is a markup over labor, okay? And if you have no fringe, that's the markup. That's it, okay? You've done that many times, and you know how it works, okay? But here I will simplify. So already I have discrete time model, one period live individual, and I will not endogenize R&D, okay? I will take the arrival rate and size of innovation as given. I will not endogenize it, okay? So I'm really much simplifying. So creativity, what are the sources of growth? One is that you have creative destruction by a new entrant. In any sector omega, at an arrival rate lambda d, you have someone who will improve your quality by gamma d, and he will drive you out of the market. That's creative destruction. That's the thing that the statistical office will not be able to take into account. The second source is incumbent innovation. I assume that in those sectors that are not subject to creative destruction, with arrival rate lambda I, the incumbent herself can innovate by size gamma I of her current product. I will assume that this is well measured. Broder-Weinstein will assume that this also is not well measured, okay? I'll be generous. I say I measure everything. Just I want what I don't. I want the missing growth from not getting the creative destruction right, okay? And finally, because I'm open-minded, I allow for new varieties to arrive, for capital N to increase at a certain rate, lambda N, and I allow new varieties to be better than old ones by a factor gamma N, okay? And those are the sources of growth in this model. Creative destruction, incumbent innovation vertical, and variety expansion, okay? And the source of missing growth is that the statistical office don't know how to take into account new goods that don't exist today, and they don't know how to take into account creative destruction. They can only take into account incumbent innovation. And I try to calculate the missing growth from that. That's what I'm doing, okay? So suppose that the government knows how to measure the statistical office MP, M. Okay, so M is the monetary output. Y is the real output. So M equal PY. So MT plus 1 over MT, that's something that's the 4%. That's the thing that the government knows how to measure. But the government doesn't know how much of it is YT plus 1 over YT, which is real growth, and how much of it is PT plus 1 over PT, which is inflation. Okay? So the true real output growth is MT plus 1 over PT divided by the true inflation, divided by PT plus 1 over PT, which is multiplied by PT over PT plus 1. Whereas the measured growth, it's this same MT plus 1 over MT divided by the measured inflation. So the missing growth comes from the fact that you misstate inflation. And we will try to understand why you misstate inflation. Okay? So, in fact, what you have immediately is that this is the missing growth, okay? And in fact, what you have typically, you will tend to overstate inflation because you miss the new goods. Typically, the new goods are better than old ones. And so you will attribute too much to inflation and not enough to quality adjustment. Okay? So now what you want to do is to calculate that and that. So we assume that the statistical focus on surviving products that are not subject to creative destruction and imputes the price growth from these for the total economy. And that's how they calculate the missing growth. So in fact, what you do is what you can show is that you see the true growth, the true growth has a part which is coming from own innovations. That's the own innovation. Okay, whenever you don't have creative destruction at a lambda I, you see, usually if I had a Cobb-Douglas, it would be log of gamma I minus 1. Okay, here it's gamma I to the sigma minus 1 because I have the CES. Okay, that's the part from own innovation. You get this one, okay, but the government, but there is the creative destruction part, and there is the new variety part. But the problem is that the government, this is crossed out, chack, 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 okay, and with probability lambda D, you think it's the same as here. So in fact, the government, what it does is that with probability lambda D, it multiplies by this. So what you have is that the true growth is this. You see, it's lambda D plus 1 minus lambda D times this lambda I, gamma I to the sigma minus 1 minus 1. You see what I mean? And that's the measured growth, that's the true growth. And the difference gives you the missing growth. And what's very nice with the missing growth is that you have all the part. You have the part from not taking into account new variety, and that's the part from not taking into account creative destruction. You can see that if lambda n and lambda d were 0, there will be no missing growth. You see? You would have log of 1, which is 0. And what's nice with this model is that you can decompose the missing growth into a new variety part and a creative destruction part. And in fact, we are capable to say how much is new variety and how much is creative destruction in the missing growth. Okay? Are you still alive? Okay. We've done the hardest. Now it's become extremely easy. This is the hardest. Now it becomes really a game of kid, okay? You've been extremely patient with me, and I don't know which one is my water. This one. Yeah. So I don't want to take your water. Okay, so that's the theory, okay? So now what we do is to say now we want to go to data. And the nice thing is there are two different methods, and they give you very different numbers. That's what comforted us, okay? The first method is to use market shares, okay? So there the idea is very intuitive. The idea using market shares is very intuitive. Is that, you see, the following is true. You look at people who continue between yesterday and today. We know that the imputation is to concentrate on the continuers. Forget about those who exit and enter. Okay? If I was right doing that, the market share of the continuers would remain constant. If the market share of the continuers is the same yesterday and today, it means that the continuers grew at the same rate of the economy. So concentrating on the continuers made me miss no growth at all. So all what I have to do is to look at how, the market share of continuers yesterday, you're right, compares with the market share today. You understand? If the market share of continuers is the same yesterday and today, it means that concentrating on continuers, I miss no growth. They grew like the economy. So just looking at them, I miss nothing. So all depends on the dynamics of the market share of continuers. You have continuers between yesterday and today. What was their market share yesterday? What is their market share today? And the beauty there, when you have the CES structure, but then you can generalize beyond the CES, but here I do with the CES, is that you get this expression, you see? Missing growth is 1 over sigma minus 1, the log of the share, the market share of continuers on continuing products divided by the yesterday, divided by their market share today. You see? That's very simple. That's the expression. So for some of those who know Finstra and Broda-Weinstein, he very much look, but in fact he's different, and I'll get back to that later. I'll tell you why it's different. Because the I is not the same I as in Finstra or Broda-Weinstein. But I don't want to go into detail. I can go into that later, okay? So that's very nice. You see, for example, you see right away, if the share of continuers, I called IT, those who continue, is the products, is the market share of products who continue between yesterday and today. If that share is the same yesterday and today, this log is log of 1, and therefore you get no missing growth. If the share yesterday is bigger than the share today, it means that in fact, the continuers, compared to the whole economy, they shrunk. That means that they grew less fast than the economy. Therefore, concentrating on them, I miss some growth. But that's exactly what you see. If SIT T minus 1 is greater than SIT T, you have log of something bigger than 1, and you get positive growth. You see? You understand how it works? Okay? Alors now what we do here for this to work, because we don't have data on products, we have only very few products, only for manufacturing. For most of the economy, we have plants. But what we assume is that we take plants after 5 years, and after 5 years, the number of products per plant remain essentially constant. So we look at plants, not products. Products, we can only do some sectors. We cannot do the whole economy. We want an estimate for the whole economy. And so we say, we look at plants in their mature version. But after 5 years, essentially plants don't grow in employment or in number of products. So we look right away at plants in their mature version. And therefore, we make this thing, we say products is plants, a constant number of products per plant. When we do this method, okay? So true growth will exceed measured growth whenever the market share of continuers shrinks over time. Intuitively, the difference between true growth and measured growth is equal to the difference between true growth and incumbent average productivity growth. And the market share of incumbent shrinks whenever the average productivity of continuers grows more slowly than the average productivity of the economy. Okay? So how do you operationalize that now? How do you operationalize that? Well, you say, look at the formula there. You have log of SIT T minus 1, log of SIT T, okay? So what you do is that you say, I know missing growth. I will denote B, the first period of operation of a plant, D, the last year of operation of the plant, and LTBD, the total employment of payroll in period T of plants that were born before small b and die after small d. So remember, you want the continuers between T minus 1 and T. Here I do T minus 1 and T. So what is the continuer T minus 1 and T? That's the employment of someone at T minus 1, who someone who is born before T minus 1 and dies after T. That's a continuer. Divided by those guys plus those who die in T minus 1. Those are the exiters. Okay? What is now the share at time T of the continuers between T minus 1 and T? Well, it's the employment at time T of those same guys divided by them plus the new entrants. Those are the people who enter at time T. And that's the share of the continuers at time T, you see? Okay? So you can compute that, and I can look now at missing growth in the US. We do the analysis at the plant level and use longitudinal business database, which covers all plants with at least one employee. We focus on the period 83-2013. We infer SIT T minus 1 SIT from the longitudinal business database information on employment or payroll as measure of relative market share. Okay? So one important thing is that I take plants not right away. I take them in their incarnation 5 years after, because they take time to build up capital. I take them right away when they come, but I take them in the incarnation when they are mature. You see, that's the thing, because I want a measure of market share which is more tightly related to the true quality-adjusted price of the new product. If a new product is invented that turns out to be a hit in 5 years, I want to take this into account right away. You see what I mean? I'm not interested in the transition before becoming the mature. I really want that to capture the quality of the firm. And you see, after 5 years, here is the growth in employment. You see, after plants, after 5 years, essentially, the growth rate that's in employment, but in number of products is the same. There is almost no growth after 5 years of plants. So also taking 5 years, the advantage it has is that the assumption that you have a constant number of products per plant is a reasonable assumption. So I will take sigma equal 4. Many people have bothered us with the referees on sigma. So here what we did was to take a sigma equal 4 like Reddy Weinstein. But then what I will do is that we do the sigma of Bob Hall, and then we do Visa card sigmas. And we spent 6 months on sigmas. So now I could do a whole conference on sigmas, okay? But I won't do that, okay? But it's amazingly robust. When you take the Bob Hall sigmas using claims, or you take credit cards inferred sigmas for retail and restaurant, you find very similar missing growth estimate. We spent 6 months to that. I mean, it takes also a lot of time to get the clearance for the data diffusion, okay? So that, okay, so that's what we do. Well, now we gather. Now we can just harvest. You've done the hard part. Now it's just harvesting. We've done the hard part. You've been wonderful. You've been patient, and now is the harvesting time, okay? And you can see already that's the missing growth per year on average. That's the percentage point. And you see it doesn't go down over time. You see, it's a lot. It means that productivity growth is 0.74% per year above what is estimated. It's a lot just because of they missed the creative destruction and the new products. You see what I mean? Just because of that. There are other sources of missing growth that Fernald and other people, Seychelles and other people have talked about. Just from this, you get that much. It's enormous. And it doesn't go down over time, you see? And this is missing, measured, and true. And look at that. It's very interesting because it's true that you have a slowdown. But you see, there is no slowdown in the missing part. In fact, the missing part has become a bigger fraction of the total. And in fact, the missing growth is responsible for 10% of the slowdown. 10% of the slowdown. I still have to explain the 90%, okay? I will do that later. I know you are waiting for me. I know, I will not escape it, I will not escape it. But that's already that's a lot. I mean, when you can tell people, look, my growth is 0.7 per year above what is said, that's considerable. It's not trivial. Just from the creative destruction, there may be still other source of mismeasurement, which I'm not factoring in here, okay? So you can start different sigmas. You can use employment market share or payroll market share or revenue market share. It's amazing. And here what you can do is that you can do, instead of doing by the whole economy in one go, can you still hear me? Because I have the feeling I lose my antennas there. Can you still hear me? Yeah, you can, because here I'm losing it, okay? So here what you do is that you assume, I do another way. Instead of doing sigma equal 4 uniformly, I take sectoral, first 1 digit or 2 digit or 3 digit. I assume that you have sigma equal 4 within, and I do sigma equal 1, Cobb-Douglas between. And I got very similar figures. But the other thing is to say that within, instead of doing sigma equal 4, I do Bob Hall or the credit cards, and I get very similar figures. Okay? 6 months of work for 2 tables. That's research. I told Macron, it's amazing. It took you, Macron in 2014, he called me and said, look, I want to leave Hollande. He said, that's perfect. And I want to come and visit you at Harvard. Could you get me an office? It was in 2014. And it took him 3 years to be elected president. I said, it takes me 3 years to revise a paper. Anyway, that's a joke. He was perfect for this, Had to. Okay. So, okay. So you can look at missing growth for various. Very interesting that manufacturing has very small missing growth in manufacturing, and presumably that's why because employment, it's a sector that shrunk a lot. And that's why we believe you have low missing growth in manufacturing. That is interesting. That's the 1-digit decomposition. But of course, you have the 2-digit, the 3-digit. It's interesting. Now here what we do is that we look at the correlation. We do the 2-digit, and on the horizontal axis you have the kind of measure of annual entry rate, but I could have done turnover in the various in the corresponding 2-digit sector, and the amount of missing growth in the sector. And you see very much, and it's an average 83 2009, and you see very much a positive correlation between. You remember the motivating evidence that I gave? There would be more missing growth, less correlation. But here now I have the measure of missing growth, and I see that it is correlated with creative destruction. You see. So now I told you there is another way to do, and the other way to do is not to use market shares, is to use another method. You remember that I had the formula I had a formula for missing growth which was like this, which had lambdas and gammas. And so what you could do is to say, why don't we use firm-level data and various moments on them to estimate the lambdas and the gammas? But that has been done by Garcia-Macia, Clino, and Say in a paper which is, I think, almost forthcoming in Econometrica or revised, or I don't want to say something, but it's well in shape for Econometrica if it's not already accepted. I don't ask every day, Pete. And so what we adapted here. So what we do is that we do what they do, but in their paper, they don't have missing growth. They assume, and usually when they have size, you remember when you have the basic model with O-weight, G equal lambda log of gamma. So when you know lambda, you know, and G, you know gamma. You see what I mean? You can use data. And so the idea there is to use moments. You see it on firms. I mean, you use TFP growth, exit rates of firm by age, employment by age, job destruction and creation, etc., of firms and not plants, to infer arrival rates and step size, using the fact that you have the relationship between growth and step size. But we know there is missing growth, so you have to redo. What we do is to redo. We mobilize all the computers of LSE to do that, because it's a huge work to do that, to recompute Garcia-Macia, Clino, and Say. But the way we did was the following. You see, we say, well, suppose that you, assume a given value of total true productivity growth. For given assumed GU, you can derive the lambdas and the gammas by running their algorithm. But that will give you a value for measured growth. Because when you have the lambdas and the gammas, you know measured growth, what it is. I had it from before. Okay, I had the measured growth. Remember, I had the measured growth. I had the measured growth here. So I could compute the measured growth, okay? So I do that. I compute the measured growth from there, exactly doing this. But then I look if the measured growth is the growth that I get, that I measure. You see, is the predicted measured growth. Is that the true measured growth? If it's the same, I converge. If it's not the same, I start a different value of GU, and I keep going. And I keep going until I fall back on my feet. And when I fall back on my feet, is the U star where the deduced measured growth is the actual measured growth, and it will be that number. So it's the GU that I imputed, that I assumed as a true growth, and that's the corresponding measured growth that I found, which is the exact observed measured growth. And that's the way you compute missing growth. You see what I mean? It has nothing to do with market shares. And the beauty of it is that you find very similar magnitude this way than you do with the market shares. That's what really made us be confident. We have something there. The methods have nothing to do. They don't use the same kind of data. Here, we don't have to assume that creative destruction and new variety only come from new plants. We did not assume a constant number of products per plant. And the other thing is we can decompose missing growth into creative destruction and the new variety. And the nice thing is that we show that most of it is creative destruction, 80%, whereas only 20% comes from new variety. So I gave my chance to new variety, but 80% of the missing growth is from creative destruction, okay? Okay, now I talk about France. Well, let me talk about France. Now you won't have a French Mayer, but you want, I think. So what about France? I will tell you why I talk about France. Not just because it's my country, but and I like it. It's because you learn something from comparing US and France. And the thing is as follows. You say, well, we have other data sets from INSEE and establishment level data. And we have the DADS. And I know some people here use French data, no? I mean, and so we have these boxes. If you come to my office at college, it's full of CASD boxes. And we know the precise location of establishment, degree of registration, workforce size, etc. Again, after 5 years, there is no growth of establishment. So the same thing is true that was true for US. And the data has nothing to do with the US data. And that's the various missing growth. So that's the average between 2004 2015. So that's full-time equivalent. US, they use head count. They use how many people you have on the 31st of December. But the full-time equivalent, they say sometimes is part-time employed. I count part-time employment. That's something they didn't do. When I did when I use employment for market share in the US, I was using really head count and not full-time equivalent. So, but you get very similar, it's in the same ballpark. You see, what's amazing is that the missing growth is in the same ballpark as the US missing growth, you see? And that's what you find, with different K, with different sigmas, but that's what you find across sectors. You find a bit smaller again with manufacturing, not as low as US, but still smaller than elsewhere. And that's in France, in regions, you see. You have a lot of creative missing growth here. Here, Barcelona is here. You are very close to the high missing growth region, Voilà. And that's the south, Côte d'Azur, Paris. That's very interesting. But what's very interesting is that those are areas where you have more creative destruction. So again, in France, if you look geographically, you see more missing growth where you have more creative destruction. The terrible thing in France is this, you see. The war, 2 world wars left this zone in France completely dead. If you go to Alsace-Lorraine, it's a huge cemetery. And there you have no growth and no missing growth, essentially. Yeah. Nobody from Lorraine, or usually I'm very blunder. Me, it's not me. No, but you. Okay. So, so that's the thing. And so you have, what's very interesting is that missing growth, if I use the full-time equivalent, is equal to the measured growth. So in France, you have a lower, but here is full-time equivalent. But you see that over the recent period, missing growth is as big as measured growth in France. So that's why the INSEE is getting very worried about that. Now, comparing between US and France, here I use not full-time equivalent, but I use head count. And when you use head count, that's the missing growth in France, and that's the missing growth in US over the period 2006-2013. And they look very similar. But now I want to go to that, because behind this similarity, there are differences. Don't be fooled by the similarities. Behind those, there are differences. And let's understand what it is, okay? So let's look at the life cycle of firms, because behind that, you have the death and birth of firms. And so that's where the firm dynamics comes. That's Schumpeterian growth economics. You really go to the firm dynamics. You see, that's really what differentiates us from other growth economists, okay? So that's, US first. So that's very interesting. Some people said, how could you have persistent missing growth when you had declining dynamism? But the declining dynamism is that the gross entry of firms have gone down. But the net entry of plants has not gone down in the US or France. Gross entry of firms has gone down, but net entry of plants has not gone down. And that's what matters for the missing growth. Okay? And that's the net entry of plants in France, and that's in the US, in France and the US. And both have remained pretty much stable. And now let me go to the fun part. Because you see, you have the movie, and the movie has to get to a kind of denouement. Okay? And here is the exciting thing between France and US. Look first at the employment share by age in France versus US. What do you see? You have older firms. The older firms in US, account for a bigger share of employment. Why? Because in US, if you are good, you can grow more. You find venture capitalists, you find institutional investors, you can grow more, and the selection process in US operates better. That means those who grow are the good ones who have the potential to grow. In France, essentially, now they have a lot of startups. Macron is very proud of saying, I'm a startup. Yeah, but you're a startup, but they don't continue. They come and they go. They don't survive. You see what I mean? So in France, the young firms account for a disproportionate fraction of employment. You see? The entrants account for a disproportionate fraction of employment compared to US. Okay, first thing. Second thing, you see, that's the growth of plants in France with age, and that's the growth of plants with age in US. You see, that's a picture à la Clino, say, and you grow more. So that reflects both the fact that a firm can grow more because it gets more finance, but also because the selection process operates better. Okay. Now what I'm showing you here is the exit rate by age. Here, in both places, and that was a prediction of Clété-Cortum, you know that young firms, which are usually the smaller firms, they exit more. Because, for example, in the Clété-Cortum model, if you are young, you have one line only. It takes you one creative destruction to disappear. If you are old and you have 10 lines, it takes 10 creative destruction to disappear, okay? So the Clété-Cortum gives it to you right away, this prediction. Okay, but that's you observe, it's true in the data, okay? But now, why is that interesting? Because I already know that young firms and new entrants account for a bigger share of employment in France than the US. But exiters will also account for a bigger share because that exiters are mainly young, and young are bigger share of employment in France. So that means that entrants and exiters will account for a bigger share in France. But look now at missing growth. Remember, look at this. That's the nice part. That's my expression of missing growth. I can express total employment at time t at employment of continuers plus exiters. Employment at t plus 1 is the employment of the continuers at t plus 1 plus the new entrants. Okay? So I can express those guys like this. If those guys are small, approximately missing growth is the entry rate, is the entry share, is the employment share of new entrants next period minus the employment share of exiters this period. Both of them, you see, the beauty of it is that both of them are bigger in France than in the US. Both the employment share of new entrants and the employment share of exiters are bigger in France. But because the missing growth is proportional to the difference, you find a missing growth which is very similar between France and the US. So behind the similarity in missing growth, you have very different firm dynamics. Being mediocre in France plays both ways. You see what I mean? It compensates. It's, voilà. But, okay, so that's an interesting thing, is that behind the similarity in missing growth, you have a important difference in the firm dynamics, but they somehow compensate each other out, okay? How long do I have left? Minus how much?
25.
I have 25 minutes?
Yes.
Oh my God, it's more than I need. No, I will. Oh, usually I have much less. Okay. Oh, it's great. Conclusion. Alors, that's conclusion of the first part. But the second part is very short. The first part is very short. Yeah. Conclusion. So the conclusion is that, missing growth is about between 1/4 and 1/3 in US, between 1/3 and 1/2 in France, just due to creative destruction, okay? Now, why should we care? Alors, you should say, that's a debate we should have with our speaker this afternoon, and I would say some things that, maybe you think that's not at all warranted. Why should we care? But for example, if we believe that growth is higher than we think, inflation, is higher than we think, if we believe that inflation is lower than we think and growth is higher than we think, maybe inflation targeting is not right, or maybe it takes that into account. I don't know if Blanchard would be happy with that. You see, we want to have a higher inflation target. But should you, at least there is the open question, does it have any implication on how to do inflation? For example, in Europe, as you know, that Draghi has changed a bit the culture, but central bankers used to have the obsession of inflation in Europe. But what we are saying is that in Europe, inflation is less than what you think. So maybe priority is not to fight inflation. So I don't know. That's a debate. Does it have implication? Also, if you want to do, I assume here the lambdas and gammas were exogenous, but you could endogenize them and do welfare analysis of growth policy. And there you should take into account the mismeasurement. Maybe we don't know how to measure the effects of various types of innovation-inducing policies on welfare because we don't know how to measure the growth effects of those policies. And that's another thing that could do. Finally, and that's the end of the end, back to Gordon. You remember the slowdown. Alors what we have, in fact, is that the curve is above Gordon. You see, if I look at Gordon, the curve is above. But still, do I call that stagnation? You see what I mean? My first response I had with Gordon is to say, look, it's true that it's going down. If I go back, you see, all the way back. If I go back to this, it's true that we tend to go down, but the true curve is above this one. And in fact, here it's a bit less going down. You see, a bit less. So he says secular stagnation. I would say secular, but I would not say stagnation. When you have a growth rate of productivity of 172% on average per year over the period 2006-2013, in France, you don't call that stagnation. In France, you call that nirvana. You see? But it's but secular still we have to explain. So because now we have to look at secular, I will now go and talk about the second part. Can I go to the second slide? Second part. Oh my God, this is really, I'm very impressed. Okay, now this, by the way, is extremely preliminary. It's just a sketch, okay? I should not be showing something like this, but I just want to give some ideas to you. And it will take me 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I just want to show you where we are going. It's not yet, I will just show you where we go, okay? So we want to explain why we had this slowdown, but there are a number of facts that happened since the crisis in particular. Or let's say between 95 and nowadays, okay? It's research in progress with the same co-authors as the missing growth, okay? So there is several facts, and I just want to put those facts in your mind, okay? And the first fact is that you have a rise and decline in productivity growth. That's the average productivity growth per year, yearly, over these 3 periods. You see, it goes up 95 to 2005 and then goes down, okay? So that's the thing, it goes up and down. Why is that, okay? Second fact, you have declining entry and exit over the last period. You see, for example, if you look over the period where growth goes down, entry and exit also go down. In fact, it's even before, but you have declining entry and exit, and particularly entry, okay? Third fact, you have rising market share concentration. You have an increased concentration of market share in most industries over the period 1997-2017, in particular in IT sector with the emergence of GAFAM. And the fraction of industries where the 4 biggest firms account for more than 30% of total market share has increased from 30% to 40% between from 97 to 2017. And so those are taken from Autor et al. You've seen those pictures. You see that the concentration, you have various measures. You take the share, market share of the 4 biggest, of the 20 biggest, according to sales or according to employment. But whatever you do, you find, that's manufacturing, you have finance, you have retail. I could put retail, all sectors, you find an increasing concentration. Okay, so that's another thing to factor in. You have a declining average labor share. We know that since 2007, the labor share has decreased from 65% 58. And what's interesting is that, for example, those are the guys. And what's interesting is that the labor share has increased not so much within firm, but between firm. Is the firms with lower labor share that have become more important. That's another fact that you want to explain, okay? Then you have the non-increasing investment, Gutierrez Philippon, and you have non-increasing investment relative to nominal GDP. And then you have the increase in average markup. But then again, the markups, it's not that they have declined within they have increased within firms. If anything, they have declined within firms. It's that the firms with high markups have become bigger compared to the other firms. It's a between firm thing. So any explanation that would have a within firm increase in markups, you should be very skeptical because it's a between firm phenomenon. It's not a within firm phenomenon, okay? So now, what are we doing? So here you see the markup, you see the cross entropy, which is the average of within across firms is going down, but the between, the overall markup due to the between effect is going up. And you see very much these two things. So explaining these facts, and I will tell you where we are going. So it's really when I show is a beginning, but I just want to tell you where we are going. We are developing a new Schumpeterian growth model with superstar firms, and I will tell you in a moment what a superstar firm is. There is a final good produced with continuum of intermediate inputs, like I had before. Okay, so forget about this variety, and you see like the log of qi, yi. but you could have CES if you want, okay? And that's you produce with continuum of goods, and that's the quality of variety I, okay? And now the novelty is that the input producers can expand on several lines. So, for example, in Clété Kortum, you can add a line one at a time. Here, you can add a continuum in one go. You can, boom, you can do like this. You can expand in a continuum of lines. Of course, there is a convex cost of running more lines, and so that's why there will be a boundary of the firm. But you will try to expand as much as you can, okay? And you expand through creative destruction on other lines. So running n lines involve an overhead cost which is increasing and convex in n. This leads to a natural boundary for firms. Each firm has a quality on each specific line, the Q of I. But in addition to the quality, there is a time-invariant heterogeneity in the firm's specific productivity level. The idea is that you innovate to improve the quality on the line, but also you can be, you, Andreu, you can be, for any quality, you are better at exploiting the line than I am. For example, because you access a network and I don't. You see what I mean? So there is a dimension where I can innovate, but there is a dimension where I can never catch up with you because you are deep down better than me. You have an access that I don't have. Okay? So you have these two dimensions, and a small subset of firms, call them superstar, are like Andreu. They have lower production costs for any quality level. For example, because of a network effect. So you say Y of I is the amount of labor times the phi. The phi for Andreu is bigger than for me. So Andreu, to produce a given Y, he needs less L than I would need. You see? For given quality and given L, he needs less L because he has this network access. Okay? So the markup, my markup, suppose my fringe is G prime, my markup will be determined not only by how better my quality is to the other quality, and that is something you take by innovation, but it will also depend on whether I have this cost advantage or not over the incumbent firm, you see? And suppose, for example, that you have two types of firm, the superstar with a phi H and the non-superstar with a phi L, and the ratio is delta greater than 1, okay? So now, no math. You look now at an effect of a downward shift in the overhead cost of running many lines. Suppose you have now a GPT. It's less costly to run more lines. What will happen? Andreu will expand much more than I do. He will expand like mad. And he will inhibit me. He will inhibit my R&D. You see what I mean? And that gives you everything, because Andreu is a higher markup person. And that will give you, so at the beginning, because Andreu expands, aggregate productivity growth will first increase, because it allows Andreu to expand. But then our growth will go down in the long run, because he will discourage innovation by non-superstar firms, which are the bigger number of firms. You see what I mean? And overall, superstar firms become larger, which leads to higher static efficiency. However, this comes at the expense of aggregate productivity growth, which declines in the long run. The model can explain the above facts. You have increasing, then decreasing productivity growth. You remember? You have average markup increase. Why? Because Andreu will have more lines. Andreu has a higher markup. So the average markup, but it's not that Andreu's markup will go up. Andreu will run more lines. So it's a between-firm effect. It's not a within-firm effect, okay? The labor share, Andreu tends to employ less people because he has a higher phi. So the labor share will go down because Andreu, who hires less people, will run more lines and I run less. And finally, investment and entry by me will be discouraged, you see? And that's the thing. Here we simulated the model. Here we assume that it takes 5 periods to decline, to reduce this parameter of cost of overhead. Growth goes up and then goes down. And that's the share of firms, you know, that are superstar. The share of lines run by superstar firms goes up. But the growth goes up and down, you see? And that's what you have. That's when it takes 1 period to reduce the growth. So the role of the state, by one role, is to say, have more people access the network. The problem there is that you have very few Andreus in the market. If you have more Andreus, things would be very different. Because then growth would go up, essentially. You inhibit people, but you inhibit few people. the growth effect on the people you don't innovate is more important than the discouraging effect on people. So if the phi is the proportion of firms that are very productive, that access a network, if this phi is high enough, in fact, what you get is that instead of having this, you have this increasing growth. So the growth ends up being higher than it was initially. So you can see there is a role for competition policy. Competition policy is now in terms of accessing networks, of making sure that more firms can have this advantage that superstar firms have. And there you would restore the positive effects. The big thing now is that people wait a lot from AI and from the new technology of information. The thing is that it's true, initially they give you growth, but because those firms monopolize many lines, they inhibited R&D in many lines, and that's what you don't want. So something that was supposed to be boosting growth gave rise to the opposite because of this superstar effect. And what you want to do is to adapt competition policy to make sure that you limit the extent to which this can happen. And that's the direction in which we are going. But that's very much, I wanted to show that that's research in progress. And voilà. Anyway, I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much for an interesting and pleasantly lively presentation. We have time for a Q&A session. So, yeah.
I was wondering about the initial discussion was this decomposition between inflation, which is badly measured, and then the real part, which is properly measured.
Yeah.
But some of the theories about the missing growth have to do with the bad measurement of the real part because of the service economy. You're moving from manufacturing to services. Services are more difficult to measure. And at the end, you end up, and it's interesting that in your ranking of sectors, manufacturing is down there, and all the services are up there. So I wonder how, is that identifying separately these two effects, or one effect is shut down, or they are related?
It could be that the measurement is worse in services, but it could be also that the shrinking manufacturing is partly responsible. We think it has also to do with the fact that the sector has shrunk over time. So that's, voilà. But it would be interesting to find out how much is the shrinking versus deep down that it's, we think it's the shrinking mostly that is responsible, but we can have can look into that.
One thing we see in the aggregate productivity statistics is that they're considerably revised over time. And we expect that as they're revised, the imputation problem is considerably reduced. So my question is, how does the degree of missing growth vary, after productivity growth statistics are initially reported?
But we hope that, for example, already something we think what would improve things is that when you impute, you would, for example, use only innovating products. You see what I mean? You would not impute on all products. We would just impute on innovating ones. So that already would help you. One thing that they cannot do, one advantage we have over BLS or INSEE in France, we have data on market size, and we apply a K equal 5 years lag for entry date. You see, we look at plants in their next incarnation. They don't have that. They don't know right away if it's a hit or not a hit. So that's an advantage we have necessarily. But even without that, they could already improve a bit by, for example, doing the imputation in a finer way. Take out those firms that don't innovate and just keep those who innovate. So that would be already an improvement. But they would be hard for them to right away look at the incarnation 5 years down the road of a firm. That's something they would have trouble to do.
So about the second part of the talk,
Yeah.
You mentioned, what possible competition policy you could have to mitigate the long-run effects of these superstar firms, and you said, thinking of it in terms of giving access to networks.
Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about what you mean by networks, more concretely?
So for example, you have this kind, the digital revolution has created a number of networks, and you have access cost, and so somehow you charge firms that enter those and so that's something all what you charge them, it's less that they can invest in R&D and all that. So maybe there is something to be. I haven't looked in the detail of how competition policy could be, but it's clear that these big firms inhibit this small. So for various reasons, is it just because of access? Is it because they constrain them to be in a certain to be compatible with what they do? That's what we need to think about when we want to think about competition to adapt competition policy. But data access, I think, is a big dimension of. But look, I haven't looked into competition policy, but seen from outside, that certainly is part of what should be looked at. Yes.
So I have a question as well on the last part of your talk. So some people are concerned that when there are these superstar firms, and then there are these smaller firms who have big ideas, as soon as they start to develop these ideas, then the superstar firm will acquire them. And some people say, well, if this is the case, then there are not enough incentives for innovation. On the other hand, one could say that exit, this is just another form of exit. No? You develop the idea and then you sell. And so all the incentives for innovation are still there. So I want to know.
Yeah, so we have a version, we developed a version of the model where we allow for merger and acquisition, but you still have the problem. A bit less, it's a bit mitigated, but still, of course, at which price are you bought? And still there you lose, because that firm has bargaining power. But so you can generalize the analysis to merger acquisition. But it's true with merger acquisition, it's a bit less. You mitigate a little bit, but still you have the same kind of shape. So we have a whole part with merger and acquisition, actually. Yeah.
Hi, you have done calculations for the United States, for France. Would you expect France to be representative of Europe, or you would expect differences in Europe, and how that will affect to regional rates of growth, convergence, etc. in Europe?
I would expect that areas with more creative destruction would have a bigger problem. You see, the same way I look at regions within France, you could look at countries within Europe. So I know now, for example, it's very interesting. Sweden is developing this kind of analysis. UK is developing. Italy, at the Bank of Italy, they are developing. I don't know if the Bank of Spain or here or whatever would be interesting doing some analysis, and see whether still within across Europe, for example, in particular, creative destruction correlates positively with that kind of missing growth. But you're right, it would be interesting to find out. And is it really a problem mostly of the developed part of Europe, or is it also as big a problem in for example, Central Eastern Europe, for example, or not, in catching up Europe? And that would be very interesting to find out.
Okay, so I think we can close the Q&A session, and thanks, Philippe, once again.
Thanks so much. Thank you.